Tuesday, 1 December 2020. In my variations on the theme of life, I wrote, "The world is a metaphor for a concept that cannot be made literal." But we know that the term world is used for many different things in many different contexts. And one of those meanings is the earth. And from this perspective, the overview effect for the first time allows us to give a representation of the world, where the world is understood as the planet that we inhabit. So, if you ask the question, how can we represent the world to ourselves, and what conceptual framework we need in order to represent the world, in most cases, we cannot represent the world. We represent some part of the world. We understand that it's a part. But with the overview effect, the sense of the world that means planet Earth, that we can now represent to ourselves. We have the empirical data, and we have a conceptual framework that allows us to adequately conceptualize the world as planet Earth. Now, the other senses of a world, like in Kant's inaugural lecture, where he defines a world as a whole that's not part of any greater whole, if I remember correctly, we could say that we have conceptually represented this to us because we have these concepts of whole and part and that sort of thing. But we don't have the empirical basis for it. And of course, this idea of world is very abstract, so there might not be any empirical basis for it. We have a pretty good idea now of what it would be to have an overview of the Milky Way galaxy. So we already have the conceptual framework of that. But the empirical side of that is going to come a long time in the future, if ever. So once you reach a sufficient level of sophistication of the conceptual framework, you can extrapolate beyond the bounds of sense, as Strawson said of Kant. But we've developed a naturalistic framework that allows us to understand the natural world, in many cases to predict and anticipate it, and to depict it for ourselves, to represent it to ourselves. But whether we can represent to ourselves other conceptions of the world, that's a question. We can do so very abstractly, but can we do so in any other sense? And do those senses matter? Our natural science representation of the world has proven to be practically efficacious and has greatly spurred the growth of knowledge. But as I've observed in my recent work on Husserl, it's not the only possible way to grasp the world. There could be a world in the sense of Husserl's sense of science, the science in the Husserlian sense. And it would be different than the world understood in the natural science sense, which is the planet Earth, or the whole of the universe. And the whole of the universe, of course, is our knowledge is very limited, and our conceptual framework still is in the making and far from being adequate to the task. But the past attempts to create the philosophy and science, which are not clearly distinct prior to the scientific revolution, were essentially attempting to do science in the Husserlian sense. They were trying to get clear about the metaphysical presuppositions of thought before they proceeded on to do science. And science just sort of like, the scientific revolution short-circuited that process and just went forward with doing science without clarifying the metaphysical foundations of the knowledge, much as Leibniz and Newton just posited infinitesimals or Fluxions in order to be able to do the calculus without shoring up the metaphysical presuppositions of the calculus. But it's arguable that the conceptual framework prior to the scientific revolution was first in the West, the Ptolemaic synthesis of ancient science of Aristotle and Ptolemy and Euclid. And then that slowly was transformed under the collective work of scholasticism. So it was still largely Ptolemaic and Aristotelian, but it also had a generous admixture of Christian theology and a number of other scientific, philosophical, and logical ideas that did not yet exist in the ancient world. But still, there was an attempt to conduct science in the Husserlian sense, but it didn't look like it was going anywhere. You could say that the economy of the world was becoming more sophisticated. There was a much greater division of labor. There was also in religious life, with the Protestant Reformation, there was a much greater diversity of thought and more exploration of different ways of life. And the breakdown of the scholastic synthesis, while it was a disaster for some, was the opening up of a world and new possibilities. And all these new possibilities, economic and theological and social, are essentially what made the scientific revolution possible, and we're tightly coupled with a lot of the events of the scientific revolution. And then the scientific revolution gives us science in a naturalistic sense. And the whole idea of science in a Husserlian sense is completely lost. And we could argue that now that we have had the experience of formulating science in the naturalistic sense, and we have this enormous body of scientific knowledge, that this needs to be the natural order of knowledge, the order of discovery, to use Reichenbach's phrase, if I'm remembering correctly. And we needed to build the scientific knowledge first and then seek the metaphysical presuppositions of science in a way that would create a science in a Husserlian sense that embraced, included, and completely contained within itself the whole of natural science, and even the infinite extrapolation of natural science to the infinite possibilities of natural knowledge, no less than the infinite possibilities of formal knowledge. And we could argue that before the scientific revolution, that Western humanity had gotten the order of things wrong. We tried to do the metaphysical foundations first and create science in the Husserlian sense without doing the science first and knowing what the scientific knowledge was. Now, Karl Popper's argument for indeterminism is that we cannot predict what knowledge will bring, and we could use that in this context to say that, until we do the natural science, we can't know what that is, and we can't know what needs a metaphysical foundation, so that we need to have this historical order. And of course, you can go a step further back, and you could say that natural science, in the sense that we know it, couldn't have happened without being preceded by scholasticism. Scholasticism could not have happened without being preceded by Greek science, and so on. So that we get a sequence of events, historical events, that needed to happen in order to bring us natural science, and the next step would be science in the Husserlian sense that makes use of natural science and gives it the foundation that it does not now have.